Right, welcome everybody. So as part of your leadership training programme, we thought that it might make a nice change that instead of hearing from me about the theory and the tools, that you could hear from somebody who got some real world leadership experience from kind of a diverse environment. So we are delighted to have with us Jean Lambert, who, amongst her many roles, has been a member of the Green Party and served in the European Parliament for 20 years. We'll find out more about some of the other things she was involved with shortly. What we're going to do is we've got a couple of questions to start things off, and then we will invite you to submit some questions as well. So if while we're chatting and if while Jean's sharing, you do have questions that you'd like to ask, pop them in the chat and I will keep an eye on those questions. And then when we hand over to you, I'll invite you to ask your question and we'll try and squeeze in as many as we can. So we've got this for about half an hour. And without further ado, I'll kind of hand over to Jean and ask her, perhaps if you start by introducing a bit about yourself and telling us about your leadership journey.
Calling it a leadership journey sounds very grand. I was saying to Gemma before we started that, you know, looking at the programme for the course that you're doing, it's maybe the sort of thing that I wish I had done some time back, because my leadership journey, I suppose, has basically been enthusiastic amateur and, you know, sort of handling stuff almost as it sort of got thrown at you. As Gemma said, I was a member of the European Parliament for 20 years, which, looking at many of you, makes me now feel even older, from 1999 to 2019. And I was representing the region of London, as you know, one of the most diverse cities, certainly in the European Union. And before that, I'd been in teaching for quite a while. And also had held sort of voluntary roles within the Green Party in the UK and then England and Wales once Scotland became an independent party, sort of as a voluntary thing while the party was developing. And actually the party's sort of celebrating, I suppose, its 50th anniversary this year. So we've been doing quite a lot of looking back at how we started and, you know, where we are now, where we might be going. So within the party, I've held various roles up until I got elected, including as a co-chair when we had that format of 3 people chairing a party council of about 30 people, which then shifted through quite an acrimonious constitutional change, as these things often are within the party, to a system of executive with people holding the public speaker roles. And so I was also a chair of the executive for a year or two and also a party speaker. But as I say, my main experience before I got elected was in teaching. And I think, you know, shifting from that to sort of full-time politics was, let's say, interesting. That teaching, of course, you've got in some respects a very defined role in a classroom. You know, you are absolutely, in theory, at any rate, the person in charge, providing your class allows you to be. That you work with them by a mixture of sort of persuasion, threat at times, you know, and you are also part of a structure within the school and you have a role within that structure. There are goals for you, often set for you increasingly over my time in teaching by both the government and within the school itself. So you've got that sort of clear role. And then there you are in the European Parliament, you're elected. Certainly in my situation and my colleague Caroline Lucas, we were coming from a party where actually we now had more staff as elected members of the European Parliament than our party had. There was no sort of infrastructure to support us really, apart from, you know, voluntary people who got various and some very sound experience in human resources, accounting, this sort of thing. Unlike some other political parties where there was a very defined structure. And once you got elected as an MEP, there was the support service, as it were, that said, okay, this is how you do it. These are the pay rates that we have. You know, this is the structure within the party. This is how we do things. We were sort of inventing the UK part of it, even though the group, the Green Group at the time, had sort of quite a loose structure. So there you are, sort of in charge and effectively almost running a small business without ever having wanted to run a small business for employment, all the rest of it, as well as then having to do the politics within a group, coming from a variety of different countries, working your way into that. I mean, at least I knew the group. I'd had a connection with it for a couple of years, you know, 10 years previously. So at least I had some experience there. So here you are with all of these things coming at you, trying to sort out what you're doing. Luckily, before the days of social media, so people couldn't comment on how useless you were at such and such, and why weren't you replying to their emails or whatever. I mean, you know, so at least you had a bit of time and a bit of privacy almost to work out what it was you were doing. And also, because you're within the European Parliament, it's a structure too where the rules changed over time about not so much your role in the Parliament, but about the role of your staff, who was in charge of them. So again, a lot of the things that we'd set up as a sort of protection mechanism and a support mechanism to begin with, in the interest of transparency, accountability, all those important things, you know, within politics, and an arm's length approach to certainly some of the money, and a way of trying to protect your staff to make sure that, you know, you were going to be a sort of responsible boss. As things changed and tightened up, they then began to look highly suspect, because this was your party working with you to provide a support mechanism, and, you know, where was all the influence and who was really in charge. So again, trying to work all of that out in a big bureaucracy, increasingly with people watching what you're doing all the time. I suppose maybe at times didn't leave you an awful lot of time for reflection, you know, but more just getting on and doing it, learning by experience, and, you know, trying to work out, I suppose, what you were doing in terms of political leadership, as well as leadership within the team that you were in, within the political group that you were in, and how do you balance all of these sort of calls upon you and pulls upon you, at the same time as trying to get on and be an effective elected representative. So that would be my introductory sort of reason for not being able to discuss the theory of leadership.
You've actually named quite a few challenges there in that, finding the balance, perhaps being and feeling like an amateur in the role and working it out as you go, and scaling up within that bureaucracy and having to work it out. Are there any other challenges that you faced as a leader, and how did you deal with some of those challenges that you came across?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it is this question about time and prioritization. You know, particularly as sort of you go on and you take on more responsibility within the group, and I had some. I mean, I was on two committees, the Employment and Social Affairs Committee and on the Civil Liberties one. So I was dealing with legislation, and increasingly in co-decision. So you're actually in a position where, to start off with, a lot of the stuff that we did on asylum and immigration, for example, Parliament would give its opinion. Council, the ministers, would basically go, well, that's very interesting, and put it on a shelf somewhere, I always thought, to co-decision, where you really are in a position of having to get a majority in the House and then be able to actually negotiate that with Council. So you're taking on that responsibility, which isn't just what you want to be doing, but it's also a position of your group. So you're negotiating in a sense within your own head about what it is you're trying to do, plus within the team of other members of your committee from your same political party. And that isn't always easy because there are different political backgrounds, different political expectations, even different ways of sort of political expression. So you have to learn a language where you basically all end up understanding words in the same way. Yeah. Before you then can even put that into the parliament and try and negotiate it with other political groups and win as much as you possibly can. So you've got all of that and the work within the parliament that's going on, which is very nitty-gritty, very much about exact wording, where can we find an agreement, and so on. At the same time as you're also trying to persuade people in the outside the parliament that you are actually doing an effective job of representing them. So, you know, that's always a sort of a juggling act. And I think that one of the strengths that we have within the political group is actually teamwork. The staff that we employ ourselves, and one of the things I've learned is that in many ways you are only as good as the staff that you've got and the support they give you. And therefore you really need to try and make sure that you are working as a team. And that if you've got a weak member in that team that basically relies on the goodwill of others, you have to deal with that. And I think it took me a while to understand that you know, that you weren't being fair to other people in your team if you let people get away with basically assuming that others would effectively cover for them. And I think some of the most difficult sort of experiences I've had in that sort of management sense have been about how you deal with people that are sort of taking advantage in the sense of the freedom that you have within the group. Because I like employing people who've got good ideas, people that push you, people that suggest, you know, there are other ways of doing this, have you thought about, and also an opportunity for people to develop their own talents and their own expertise. Because quite often in the European Parliament, you are dealing with people who are maybe in their first employment, you know, or who's coming in as interns, and we have always paid our interns. I want to make that point very clear from the very beginning. We always paid. And we always did an open call for internships as well, not just on the basis of friends of friends. So that was something that we did, which we discovered wasn't actually the norm, you know, for a lot of people. So, you know, but that in a sense gives people a degree of freedom to sort of try and develop what it is they want to be doing. But it also leaves a bit of scope, particularly when you're trying to manage people in London and in Brussels and work with the group team that you don't deploy and everything else. So, you know, that's something where I wish I'd learnt that earlier, about dealing with, you know, people who don't take the responsibility seriously. But basically the staff I've had by and large have been absolutely brilliant, really dedicated, want to develop their expertise, their understanding. The group has superb staff, again, who are highly, not even just highly qualified, but they really know their stuff. And therefore, particularly as a smaller political group, having real expertise amongst your staff also means you punch above your weight in the institution. You know, so that the value of good staff that really work together as a team and really gel in that way, and you know, will support each other, support you, but will also work with that wider team. I mean, it was absolutely invaluable, absolutely invaluable. And one of the things, yeah, now that was important. And one of the other things I also learned was, well, you know, you don't, if there's a mistake in your office and that creates a problem, you don't dump on your staff. You take the responsibility as the person responsible for what is happening in your workplace. You sort it out with them afterwards, you know, And if you've got the right sort of relationship, if there's a problem, quite often they'll come and tell you in the first place, you know, and we try and sort it, but you don't dump on your staff in public. You know?
So a lot of what you've just shared is really about that good quality teamwork and trust, so that you're all on the same page, but that you've built the right team for the role, for the purpose. Would you mind telling us a bit about some of your goals and motivations as a leader? Like, sometimes there'll be tough times, so what is it that gets you through? What are you trying to achieve in your kind of role and career path?
But I think one of the reasons, you know, is to remind yourself why it's important that you're there, why you wanted to be there in the first place. And that for me, that was really having made a decision in the sense that, you know, I'm from the Greens, therefore, you know, a lot of it is about sort of the relationship we have with the world around us and with each other within that. And that part of what it is that you're doing is that you are the vehicle for that message, you know. So some of the time it's not about you, you know. It's about being there and trying to do the best possible job you can so that you can affect the change that you want. Also, when I got elected, one of the things that I had wanted to do was to try and make sure that I could build a sort of connection between the constituency, so London, bits of London, as it were, not geographically, but politically, because I don't believe that you know, once you're elected, you represent everybody, because you don't. There's some people I really wouldn't want to represent, thank you, and they probably feel the same way about me. So, you know, it was about trying to make this connection between what was happening here and bringing some of that into the Parliament, and what was happening in the Parliament and bringing it back, some of the policy stuff on some of the areas, and to try and make connections with parts of the electorate that thought the Greens had never had anything to say to them. So being on the employment committee, and I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why you end up on the committees that you do, but being on that was an obvious way to talk to people about working conditions. I mean, the Working Time Directive was one of the things that I was working on. I did a lot on free movement in legislation terms. So again, you know, a lot of the cross-border aspects were important, and particularly, you know, for a city like London, and then issues around asylum and immigration and equalities in general. So, you know, a lot of the legislation that we had coming through in the Parliament, you could actually feed back as being directly relevant, and people's experiences here, you could feed in as being relevant to the legislation that you were trying to change to make sure it worked for people. So that was, I suppose, you know, the sort of one of the key things was to, even if you were only there for one term, 5 years, to actually try and get across to some people that Greens actually had something to say to them. We weren't just about hugging trees and fluffy bunny rabbits, you know, which some people at that time thought we were. Actually much more radical than that. And of course, you know, as time's gone on, worked a lot more on sort of green transition and climate change and displacement. So, you know, being in the Parliament's a huge opportunity for all sorts of things, even if at other times it drives you mad because you're working with people that won't let you pass the legislation you want to pass because they have different ideas, which, you know, deeply frustrating.
Such as politics.
Such is politics, yeah. And I mean, you know, that's politics with a capital P. I mean, there are other places where it's politics with a small p, where also, you know, you deal with people who have different visions, don't you?
And
I try to work out, yeah, how you do that and how you win what you can. You know, I think it's important.
Yeah, and seeing, as you said, the opportunity as well as the frustration. So we've got one final question from me, and then we'll see what comes up in the chat. We've got a group here of diverse young leaders from, well, around Europe and the wider world. What advice might you give to young leaders?
I think having an idea about what it is that motivates you, what you think is important, and keeping a sense of that through whatever work it is that you're doing that you may have to do to get you where you want to be. So keeping that that in mind, and I think trying to be true to yourself within that, I think it really matters. And that also this business about you're working as part of the team, and that if you've got the right people around you, I mean, you generate so much more sort of power, influence like that, because you've got the support apart from anything else. That if it's a really rubbish day, you've got people that you can talk to about that who will understand that, and that gets you through it. And you need to find your own mechanisms for getting through it. Bad day when your energy dips, I used to find putting on some really sort of powerful dance music, and you just close the blinds and leap around the office for 15 minutes is a great sort of, okay, right, now let's get back to business. It's you have to find your own way of doing that. Other people, it might be peppermint tea, I don't know, but you find your own way of revitalizing yourself. But keep an eye on remind yourself why it is you're there, why it matters to you.
Thank you. So I'm going to invite people, if they want to ask their question themselves rather than me reading it out. I'll go to Shahin first, because yours relates to that last point on teamwork. Do you want to ask it, or I can?
Yeah, that's all fine. I mean, you can read it, or I can ask you. Hi, Jean. Thank you so much for being here. Yeah, and thank you so much for coming here. It's very impressive, your experience that you're sharing with us. In the beginning, actually, when you were talking, I just got it in front that you just say that you're only as good as your team members are. So that is a very, very deep. That sounds like very, that is actually a very common phrase that is said, but it is very deep, has a very deep meaning, and has really, really heavy. It is really heavy when someone like you from your position actually says that. So this is also a very cliche question, I think, that how do you keep improving ourselves and the team members as leader and as team player, and at the same time not to make them feel dumped on. And honestly, sometimes the personal reviews even went awry. And now with the new pop psychology, uh, I think it became more difficult. So what's your reviews and thoughts about that? Thank you.
Thank you. I think part of it is as you were saying about the reviews, and also asking people what training it is they feel they want. And I mean, at least one of the things about the European Parliament, the Brussels end of it, is the opportunities they offer for training, whether it's in languages or within IT or whatever. And therefore in our case, trying to make sure that at the UK end of it, we were also being able to offer people what it was they wanted. And sometimes, that isn't always 100% work related. In our case, we then had to find a way of trying to persuade the European Parliament to pay for it. But, to have that opportunity for people to train and develop in ways that they want to do it, that I think the regular sort of, not just team meetings, the sort of the formal side of it. Mine ended up doing regular sort of phone conferences every Monday morning to talk to each other, sort of UK and the Belgian end, but also some social stuff in there that, we would try to make sure that, maybe if it was somebody's birthday, And this may not be appropriate, of course, in all parts of the world, but we would celebrate people's birthdays. You know, so it was usually sort of champagne and cake in my office. Other people, you know, might have been something different, but that sort of thing as well, so that you've also got that opportunity just for people to talk. And it's interesting that I still see a lot of my team now, if I'm in Brussels, we will quite often still go out to dinner as a group of us and a wider grouping. So that feeling of the training, the team building in that more sort of social sense. I think also a feeling that the work that we were doing mattered, and therefore being able to tell each other about what it was we were doing, what the difficulties were, doing a bit of informal brainstorming every so often. So those sort of things, I think, work. And also then you're also trying to create an atmosphere where if you have got, we were also, one of the things that I also tried to do was to make sure that we weren't taking on too much work, because there are, particularly sort of in that political thing, there's always something coming at you. So therefore I was also particularly aware that if we took an initiative, we had to be prepared for the work that was going to bring us. You know, the public response, that whether it was going to be 1,000 emails about, you know, the the trade agreement we were working on, could we cope with that? And if we felt we couldn't cope with it, then we might not take the initiative, or we'd find another way to do it. So always trying to make sure that we were not overloading ourselves, and so that people could walk out of the door at the end of the day without feeling, you know, that there was too much still sitting on the office, on the table. I mean, the fact that I worked on the working time directive, I used to say, sort of meant that I had to make sure that I actually operated the working time directive in my own work environment, because otherwise, you know, this would just be too embarrassing if my staff were doing 70-hour weeks rather than, you know, what they were supposed to be doing. So that thing about trying to make sure that you're balancing the workload. So, you know, because there's always more you can do. But
I just want to check in, because it's very nearly time. I wonder if you've got another, have you got another 5 minutes just for us to try and squeeze in some quick questions? But if not, we can wrap up.
No, that's fine. I can do another 5 minutes. Just tell me not to talk so much.
Thank you. Right, because I very quickly, if Rashi and then Nick Shannon, will try and squeeze in short questions, short answers, so that we've had a few more voices.
Thank you, Jean, for sharing those insights. This is really helpful for us. And also, you know, you're setting a standard for us to, like an example that we can follow definitely when we are in our leadership journeys. So the first question I had for you was about what qualities do you see in people, because you were also heading the employment team, right, with the human resource. Especially you said that the Green Party was started as a volunteering thing. So what qualities do you see in people when you're hiring them? And as you said, I know you give us some examples of how to keep them motivated, but if you could share a little bit more, especially in terms of work, how can we keep them motivated?
I mean, I think in terms of the sort of the qualities, I mean, there's all the basic ones. I used to teach English, so I have an obsession about correct use of the apostrophe. So, you know, write me an application letter that tells me why you would be good for me in my office. I get a lot from people telling me about why working for me would be good for them, but, you know, tell me about that. That if we get to an interview stage, I want to see somebody who's actually quite excited about coming to work in the Parliament. I mean, you know, it's an amazing opportunity, and I feel that. I want you to feel that you're excited, and that you can show me some sort of commitment. something that you have been doing that is maybe it is relevant to the work that I'm doing. Show me you've done your homework. But you know, somebody who's excited, somebody who's committed. And in terms of the work, one of the things that we could do there was also, as it were, offer people the opportunity to work on more and more difficult work. So that to begin with, you might be sort of the person who was answering a lot of the emails about why I can't come and speak at your event, very sorry, etc. But also to try and get people engaged very early on in on some of the legislative work, so that they could take more and more responsibility within that to actually really be part of the negotiating team or drafting the amendments. And, you know, and the buzz you get when you see your wording agreed, not just in the European Parliament, but very, very occasionally actually ends up in the legislation for, you know, 450 million people or whatever, is quite something. So there's a development you can offer. And also if there are particular things that people are interested in and it works and it's relevant, then, okay, is this a project that you want to take on? You know, so I had one member of staff who got really interested in the issues around Rana Plaza and the whole sort of fashion industry. So, okay, you know, there were things she could do with that, and then went back to Australia and did quite a lot of work on it there. So that opportunity for where's the expertise that you can develop.
Thank you very much. I think actually, I'm sorry, Nick, Shannon, we're going to struggle to fit that in and get on with the rest of our training session. But just to let you know, Jean, there were some really other insightful questions in the chat about timelining a project and how does that impact your innovation. Marion commented to say she just really loved that a woman in politics is here and that women can take up spaces, which is really encouraging. And Gift had a good question about how you deal with conflicting ideas, which I know we won't have time to answer in as much depth as it deserves. Thank you ever so much for being with us this evening. I think what really stood out for me, and I hope that the group noticed, is how much of your experience around leadership is not just about you as the leader, but about your relationships with other people, which is very much what we've been looking at. And it's lovely to hear how much care you've put into building good teams and thinking about that motivation and the roles that people play that will keep them engaged and nourished as they go on. So thank you so much for spending your time with us this evening. I'll end the recording there.